we shall be speaking about this school. We already mentioned that, the Cotogni School, which has been the greatest school because the teacher was not only a teacher, was also a singer. He was a baritone. He premiered, Antonio Cotogni premiered Don Carlo in Italian in Bologna. The premiere, of course, took place in Paris in French. And he had this voice that it was encompassing the entire range. He also had the tenor, he also had the bass range, and he was extraordinary. 24 seasons at Covent Garden. He sang at the Bolshoi in St. Petersburg, and the enthusiasm of the audience was such that when he came out from the opera house, most of the audience, especially in Russia, they removed the horses from the carriage, and they were pulling the carriage with Cotogni inside to the hotel. Yeah, unbelievable. Also, one day he was singing in the Chiesa Nuova in Roma, the church where San Filippo Neri started the oratorio. And he was singing in such a way, nobody knew it was Cotogni, but the audience, the congregation started applauding so much. In those days, they were quiet in church, not the same way they do now. So they had to call the Carabineers to clear the church. This was what Cotogni was doing with that voice. And then also, one day he was doing Lina de Chamonix in Florence, and not only the singing, but his acting was so extraordinary that at a certain moment most of the musicians in the orchestra stopped playing, and the conductor found himself only half the orchestra was there playing the instrument. So this was Cotogni. We know that Cotogni produced Gigli, produced Giacomo Larivolpi, produced Benvenuto Franci, one of the greatest baritons, and also the other fantastic baritone, Stabile, also one of the greatest. So this is the school, the system which we have been using.
As singers, we trust the implicit feedback that comes from sensation. You know, it isn't always necessarily an intellectual thing. You know, the body very often tells us in very obvious ways that something works better than heretofore. And you have to trust that. And I think that's the hardest thing for most singers, is in learning how to become their own teachers and to trust their instinctive response to how the mechanism works. But it was quite obvious to me in that first session that something was different. Clearly, you know, he has a very distinguished pedigree through his father that harkens back to these great Italian singers of the pre-World War II area, of which we have no one alive that can compare with the quality of these artists, you know, and so on some fundamental level, he's bringing that information through. Of course, he did absorb it at a very young age by being with his father in these very exalted circumstances, being in the dressing room with Beniamino Gigli and all these people. But as I said, something clicked, a light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, aha, this is something important. And so we've really been working together on this now for about 10 years, and I would say to you categorically, while it's a little difficult to articulate, you know, to people who don't understand what's going on, from my perspective, the benefits are immense. I can cite as an example, for instance, that many of the great singers of today are in noticeable vocal decline fairly early on in their careers. Now, we could attribute this to flaws in their technique, and undoubtedly there's some truth to that. But for example, Beniamino Gigli, shortly before he died, when he was suffering from diabetes, made a recording of the Lorenzo Perosi Giudizio Universale, which I have and which Marcello was kind enough to introduce to me. And there is absolutely no lessening of the level of artistry in this man who was already suffering from a fatal illness. And he was very much, depending upon who he was working with, an ardent advocate of this technique, so much so that he has been criticized by later commentators who said that they felt he was a sloppy artist because he used certain types of aspirants to propel the voice. And but you can clearly see that in this very late recording, there's been no decline in the quality of the voice. You know, the vital force perhaps is diminished somewhat because of the illness, but the instrument itself is without peer, you know, and still steady and secure and effortless beautiful, you know, and much of it comes obviously from Gigli's native brilliance, you know. I mean, the very famous teacher Cesari said that he thought Gigli had a perfect voice. But even with that, the nature of what one has to do as an opera singer requires this tremendous energy force that propels the voice outward. And if one is doing that with the wrong muscle groups, the instrument will decline. And as I said, I think that's what we see. It's endemic these days. First of all, we have people who are, arriving at the pinnacle of the career without necessarily being finished vocally, but then they don't last because they're singing on the principle, as many great singers would say, instead of the interest. And I really think that this technique of what I'm calling, with Marcello's approval, l'accento, is one of the factors that contributes to vocal longevity. From my perspective, there are a couple of immediate, what's the word I would use, impacts that are involved with this technique. Number one is intelligibility of the text. Marcello has gone on record many times as saying that, even in Italy, they have a hard time understanding the opera singers singing Italian. First of all, because there's certain dialectical practices that have crept in, but also simply because the consonants don't project. And I think this is a great fallacy of the era that we're living in. We're inculcated with this notion that the vocal line is the supreme being in artistic vocal expression, that the words are of an unnecessary and regrettable hindrance. But the simple truth is that the great people who write vocal music are inspired by the words. So how could they, on any fundamental level, feel that if the words were intelligible, that would somehow do disservice to their music? And consequently, as I said, I think that we are prone to look at people who have this kind of exalted declamation as somehow overdoing it, or as I said, in the case of Gigli, for example, that their style is sloppy because they don't have this seamless legato. Now, undoubtedly, a free voice can produce a seamless legato, but the bigger the amplitude of that instrument, I think the more difficult it becomes. And particularly when you're dealing with the types of voices that sing over 70 and 80-piece orchestras without amplification, whatever you can add to the mix that allows that instrument to travel further with less strain is only going to enhance the nature of the performance. The other thing is, too, because we are a microphone culture, we hear things up close. So we forget that in the theater, often these types of things would be largely inaudible. It's like if somebody has a bad cold, but their voice is clear and they go out and they sing, whether assisted with drugs or whatever, but they go out and sing. And maybe on stage, you as a co-performer can hear that they've got a bit of catarrh, but the audience will never hear it because it does not go beyond the orchestra pit. It can't cut through the texture of the orchestra. So a lot of these techniques, I think, help to move beyond that barrier, but also are not necessarily so audible. But when you stick a microphone down somebody's throat, every little gargle that they make is going to be heard. And as I said, I think in terms of recordings, there is that putting everything under the microscope, right? There's this atomization of the performing moment, which has very little to do with the actual experience of performing. And therefore, we are much more inclined, as a consequence, to admire those little tiny voices that are so effortlessly produced and which require very little investment of energy on our part. Whereas the authentically dramatic voices, which take many years to develop and which also then require a similar scope of the engine to drive them, we are more prone to criticize. And as I said, but it was clear to me that this was really what this was all about, that a good singer with a free voice can sing. I mean, obviously you learn the technique, but in adding these extra dimensions, particularly when you're talking about the grand gestures, vocal gestures that we associate with Verdi and with Puccini and even to a lesser extent with any kind of declaimed style like recitative, right? I mean, recitative is basically sung speech, but obviously it must be very intelligible, and at the same token, it has to have the natural cadence of the language so it can be understood by the audience. So that was kind of a long way around that. I don't know.
An interesting story I wanted to say, in connection with my beginning as a diction coach. that I was working with a studio. I didn't want to overshadow the guy who was there because he was the boss, the maestro. But he was, don't mention the name, he was a guy who was not famous for his integrity, but to some extent he was honest because he had a pupil, international, who had sung at the Bolshoi and also in other places. She went to Italy and she failed, and then she said, you have to work with Marcello. So he recognized my authority, and for 3 months we worked with the soprano, and she also was a pianist, and I sang all the roles of tenors, baritons, but I was very happy because she played with great precision. And then she went to Italy, she got 2 Rigoletto, 1 Lucia, and she got an article in Gente. So that, because I'm the sort of guy of the old school in Italy, which they had a craft, an art, and were keeping it in hiding, and they were expecting other people to recognize. I found people who recognized Michele, Jim Ditch, Altruis Devon, and also many other people, and so that practically it came out anyway, because they are terrific musicians. Michele is also a pianist, is a composer, and then also what we do is this, that the phrase is balanced, musically, linguistically, and vocally, so that it's just like the tuning of an engine. It's just like the power steering of the car, which enables anybody, even a young lady without muscles, can drive a truck today.
This is an orally transmitted knowledge, and unfortunately we don't live in that type of era anymore, and the whole idea of recording, as we understand it, in a sense, is a thing of the past, because recording is no longer about archival purposes, but instead about selling records. So it's the same idea here, in that we have an orally transmitted art form. The evidence is empirical, it's not absolute. As a practitioner, and I think I'm confident in saying that I've probably worked on this technique with Marcello longer than any other singer to date. As a practitioner, I can state unequivocally that it has made a huge impact in my own art, and that I would categorize myself now as someone with the instincts of a native-born Italian with the respect to singing. Now, that may be a fallacy, but the idea that as an American approaching Italian opera, I think like an Italian, and I sing like an Italian. I think if I hear the great models, even of the last, say, 50 years, the great tenors like Mario Del Monaco, and these were really great artists. Del Monaco used much of this technique himself, and that was really, in a sense, what made it possible for that adamantine bronze voice of his to be as effective as it was, because he had this capacity to claim. It also made him one of the most tremendously exciting tenors we've seen in the last century, because he had that electricity, which was not only obviously from his fierce intelligence, but from his ability to get the drama of the vocal utterance across to the audience. We don't see that nowadays. We see these large corporate entities that go through the motions, and sometimes very effectively, but it's not the same thing. There isn't that electricity, and this is a communicative art, right? This is not about beautiful lines. Yes, absolutely. The melody is there. We love those great melodies, but it's about communication. Whether or not the sentiments are, as is the case with most arias, it's an expression of a static emotional state in a given moment, or in the more free-flowing declamation that you see with recitative and things that are more arioso-like. But it's about communication. Now, many of the people who sit in the audience wouldn't necessarily feel that way. They come to hear the sheer sensuous beauty of the sound and the melodies. But again, any composer worth his salt wants to get their message across. They're not going to be saying, oh, I'm just going to write this tune and I'll just have the singer go, mm-hmm. No, they want to get those, it's those words that inspired them in the first place, right?
What Michele said is very interesting for other language. The other day, I worked with one of my former pupils from the Harlem School in management figure in English, and it was astonishing. Yeah. The pianist there was so happy because it was flowing with complete freedom. But in other words, what Michele is describing so well is this: we have an engine which is perfectly tuned. And now they have the machines, all these computers, the electronic. In the old days, you needed somebody with a lot of good sense of experience to tune the engine, because any engine could move smoothly, but not perfectly, unless there is the perfect tuning. So this is good. Also for the language German, a lot of times also I balance in the phrase in German. There is one of my pianists, Eleanor Lang. One day she did a concert at the Bruno Walter Auditorium, and they said, "Why are you giving a recital? Because you're so lousy," they said. Then we worked on the leaders by Schumann with my system, and the next time she sang, people were crying. That was a tremendous difference. And also, when I was teaching at the Harley School, Middleton, a fantastic pianist, he always wanted me to work with him, even if it was French or German, because you said when you are there, you sing everything, the students follow you. So that is just the utmost perfection on finding the final way of handling, because they never cement, the work in which people are doing the voice, the music, the language. I mean, in our way it works, because also I'm working with the artists, they know, like James Ditch, we don't know only the language of radical, you also know the entire environment. So we work as a whole, also the knowledge we have from the great people of the past, we know the tempos, the interpretation, most of the conductors, they have no idea. So Michele is describing this so well. Wonderful, Michele, let us know even more, because
Yes,
I feel very elated.